Hello, listeners, my fellow lovers of adornment, history, and the occasional scandalous historical mess, and welcome back to another episode of Ancient History Jewelry Stories, the only jewelry podcast that also talks about royal genitalia. Yes, you heard that right, royal genitalia, because in this episode, we are going to be tackling the much requested, absolutely fascinating history of body piercing. If you know your esoteric Victorian trivia, then you probably know where I'm going with royal genitalia. And if you don't, we will get there in due time. Specifically, the next episode. Don't worry, we're also going to be discussing the history of less, shall we say, private forms of piercing, like stretched earlobes, nose piercings, lip piercings, and nipple piercings, which have a surprising amount of historical mythology surrounding them. On the last episode, I said that there would be a Patreon poll to vote on the next podcast episode, and I did not manage to get my ducks in a row in time to make that happen. So, as of next Saturday, there is a poll to determine the next podcast topic. Actually, for real, I promise. You can vote over at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories by joining the $5 a month tier. By the time I post the next episode, I will be in the motherland in Istanbul. Once Constantinople, before that Byzantium, the city of my people, the place where I spent a string of formative childhood summers, and a place that I'm always happy to come back to. So the topic options will reflect some of that. I'm going to be traveling for nearly 3 weeks in October, and I will be doing my best to share some of my travels with you on the various socials. I'll be visiting some ancient sites, some not so ancient but still very cool and historical sites, and a shitload of museums, in both Turkey and France. I'm very excited to go visit one of the world's greatest repositories of cultural theft and appropriation, the Louvre. There will be some Patreon-exclusive museum content during my trip, too. That being said, the next couple of episodes, while I'm traveling, will be a little shorter and perhaps a little less academic, a little bit lighter. I'm also splitting this topic into 2 episodes, one today and one next Wednesday. The royal genitalia will be next Wednesday. I haven't given a spicy language warning in the last few episodes, and this pertains mostly to the upcoming episode, not so much this one. But I do want to let everyone know that there is going to be some discussion of sex lives, definitely liberal sprinkling of curse words. So if you're uncomfortable with either casual swearing or finding out just how horny some historical figures were, maybe this isn't the episode for you. If you find all of this fascinating, and better yet, you are pretty sure you know exactly which historical icon sex lives I'm going to discuss, keep listening because we have quite a bit of ground to cover. And if you are coming in blind on this one, welcome! My name is Melise. I am a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques. These podcasts are part of a larger series that includes videos, also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, that I post on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. You can find me on any of those platforms under moonhoney.jewelry. We are not going to dive headlong into the titillating stuff. We have to start somewhere tame before we go all the way to Prince Albert. We will start with the most common body piercing, the earlobe. Yes, the humble earlobe piercing. So common that you probably don't even think of it when I say body piercing. It's becoming less common, but in many cultures, it isn't unusual to pierce a baby girl's ears in infancy, as young as 3 months, sometimes even younger. I am Turkish, and culturally that's the norm, so I was wearing earrings almost straight out of the gate. My love for jewelry started young. Just how acceptable this practice is varies from culture to culture, with some people viewing it as harmful and as removing the child's agency in deciding if they would like to have such body modifications done. While I do agree that cosmetically altering a child's body without their express consent is, to put it lightly, not good. This is something I've never regretted having done to me, so I can't speak about it from that perspective. I love wearing jewelry. It's a huge part of the culture I came from, and I never resented having my ears pierced. Your mileage may vary. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of anyone but myself. That being said, piercings done on babies do often end up being crooked. Since they're usually done in a hospital or doctor's office, they're being done by doctors, not professional piercers, who have a much better idea of how to put extraneous holes in your body for adornment. Nowadays, it's definitely more common to pierce girls' ears, though in some cultures, boys get their ears pierced too. Throughout history, and across many different cultures, the gender association of ear piercing has been far less binary than it is today. Most cultures that practiced the piercing of earlobes, and that's a lot of cultures, practiced it for all genders. There's strong evidence that the practice of piercing earlobes is over 5,000 years old. Ötzi, the mummy found frozen in the Alps, also known as the Iceman, has pierced lobes. He lived between 3350 and 3105 BCE. The oldest examples of earrings come from ancient Ur in Mesopotamia and date to between 2500 and 2000 BCE. In a past deep dive, we talked about how the queen's tombs at Nimrud, also in ancient Mesopotamia, were found to contain hundreds of earrings. Chances are, earlobe piercing goes back even further than the oldest known examples. It's impossible to list all of the cultures that have practiced the piercing and adorning of earlobes. It's easier to list those that didn't, which, as far as I can tell, is none. There are some modern cultural taboos surrounding ear piercing in a few cultures, but they're fairly outdated, such as Japanese women eschewing ear piercings and earrings because they're thought to be too attention-grabbing or flashy. As far as I can tell, with the research I've done for a half-hour podcast episode, there are no cultures that expressly forbid the piercing of earlobes. There was, however, a pretty strict cultural taboo against the piercing of ears during a lot of the 20th century in America. Starting in the late 1800s, earrings made with tension screwbacks started popping up, specifically made for people who didn't have their earlobes pierced. These earrings maintained popularity into the 20th century, eventually being replaced by the clip-on earring. Just based on my experience with vintage fashion and the evolution of fashion throughout history, I know that it was considered quite barbaric for a woman to pierce her ears up until the 60s or the 70s. What I find so delightfully stupid about this whole thing is that women were very much wearing earrings. The illusion was there. Screwbacks and clip-ons look, for all intents and purposes, like you're wearing something that is secured via an earlobe piercing. To separate the act of piercing from the act of wearing earrings smacks of American puritanical bullshit. This restriction against piercing ears during this time doesn't really seem to have existed anywhere else. American teenage girls of the 1950s, in what can almost be considered an act of body autonomy and counterculture revolution, would get together to hold ear-piercing parties. Maybe you remember the awfully mean slumber party scene in Greece, where they pierce Sandra Dee's ears and sing a song about what a frigid prude she is. As the practice grew in popularity, some physicians started offering piercing services, until eventually, Manhattan jewelry stores wised up and started piercing their clients themselves, thus creating the career of body piercer. Earrings are considered a feminine accessory by many people, though it's become fairly common to see young men wearing one or two earrings, usually a dangling cross a la George Michael or the Lost Boys. I think it's adorable, and I think everybody should wear earrings. Earrings, big, ostentatious, dangling, gem-encrusted, beautiful earrings, have historically been worn by men of many cultures. Notably, in ancient Korea, men wore elaborate dangling gold earrings throughout the Shilla, Goryeo, and Joseon kingdoms. I'm talking big, spangled, jingling beauties. In Japan, men of Ainu descent wore earrings until they were forbidden to do so by the Japanese government in the late 19th century. In Renaissance Europe, courtiers took to wearing one or two earrings, described by Holinshed, a contemporary historian, as some lusty courtiers and gentlemen of courage do wear either rings of gold, stones, or pearls in their ears, whereby they imagine the workmanship of God to be not a little amended. I'm a big, big fan of the mental image of a Renaissance courtier all dolled up in his bewilderingly ornate outfit, perhaps a jerkin and some slashed sleeves on a tunic, completing the look with a gem-studded hoop in one ear. It just fits. Another group of men who wholeheartedly embraced the earring, even in times when society said, "Oh no, not for me." Sailors. Traditionally, sailors would have their ears pierced when they had crossed the equator or completed a trip around the world. This has been sort of transmuted into the myth that sailors had their nipples pierced when they crossed the equator, but we will get to that on the next episode. Okay, yes, earlobe piercings. Very cool history, but sort of pedestrian. The most common piercing in the history of humanity. There are categories of earlobe piercing that are far less common and far more interesting, like the stretching of earlobes. This practice can be found in cultures around the world, although it didn't come into fashion in the so-called quote-unquote Western world until the late 20th century. Earlobe stretching has been practiced for as long as earlobe piercing has been practiced. Back to the OG pierced mummy, Ötzi, whose earlobe piercings were stretched to somewhere between 7 and 11 millimeters. King Tutankhamun was found with stretched earlobe piercings, and Buddha is depicted with very long stretched lobes, which are a symbol of giving up his earthly riches, along with his habit of wearing sumptuous bejeweled earrings. Stretched earlobe piercings are incredibly common if you just go back enough in time. That asshole Christopher Columbus took note of the stretched lobes of the Taino men he encountered in the Caribbean, and the practice was widespread throughout the Americas before he came to fuck things up, with Mayan, Mexica, Mixtec, Moche, Olmec, Inca, and other cultures stretching their lobes to wear various sensational ear ornaments, from disc-shaped plugs to hollow jade rings. Sometimes, earlobe stretching wasn't entirely intentional, simply the result of wearing heavy earrings for many years. More often, it was entirely intentional and was highlighted through the wearing of earplugs, discs, and other large ear ornaments. When stretched gradually and allowed to heal properly, pierced earlobes can hold a shocking amount of weight. The ancient Greeks, with their enthusiasm for telegraphing personal wealth through adornment, practiced earlobe stretching in order to wear more substantial amounts of gold at once. I respect that. It was initially practiced by both men and women, but was seemingly restricted to just women sometime around the 5th century BCE. Ancient Cypriots on the island of Cyprus, taking their cues from both the Greeks and Egyptians, wore elaborate and beautifully ornamented heavy golden coils in their ears. One of the earliest ornamental uses of glass was to create earplugs and discs in ancient Egypt. In fact, out of the classical cultures of the ancient world, only the Romans seemed disinterested in earlobe stretching. One of the only examples of ancient Indian jewelry I've been able to find during all of my research is an absolutely exquisite, heavily granulated ear ornament. It's a weighty thing. It would have been quite a commitment to wear it. Prior to the discovery of this singular ear weight, historians and archaeologists only had statues and temple carvings for reference, which showed earlobes stretched by pendants so heavy that they were resting on the shoulder. They had no way to discern if this was a realistic depiction or merely symbolic. This one incredible ear ornament was enough to prove that the depictions weren't hyperbolic at all, and that a pendant of such size would have absolutely stretched an earlobe enough to touch the shoulders. If you're wondering why it's so difficult to find ancient Indian jewelry, it has to do with a long-standing cultural tradition of recycling old jewelry to make something new, which is practiced in other parts of the world as well, but nowhere as continuously or as strongly as in India. Although I've been asked this many times in the past, I cannot find historical evidence for any kind of alternative ear piercing. No tragus, no conch, none of the above. There would have been a more significant risk to piercing cartilage, as it takes a lot longer to heal and can lead to some nasty complications if not taken care of properly. An earlobe hole is pretty low-stakes wound. There is evidence of multiple earlobe piercings. One specific example I can think of is the Qing Dynasty China practice of requiring all Manchurian women to have 3 piercings in each earlobe. These could be used as markers of status in the royal court, with restrictions on what kinds of earrings you could wear based on your place in the social hierarchy. For instance, if you were an attendant, you could only wear 1 pearl in each ear and gold hoops in the other piercings. If you were the empress, you could wear 3 of the finest pearls in each ear. This even led to the creation of a new earring style, one meant to look like a triple piercing for those with single holes in their earlobes. These consisted of a single hook with 3 pendants each. This may sound familiar to you if you have access to the Patreon bonus videos, as I mentioned it in the video about witchcraft and earrings in ancient China. Okay, enough ears. Next up, nose piercing, which is another low-stakes wound to inflict upon yourself, and I'd wager the second most common piercing. Well, specifically, the nostril piercing. That one is probably the second most common next to the earlobe. Septum piercings through the cartilage at the center of the nose, well, actually through the space between the cartilage at the center of the nose, is currently less common but has as much historic precedent as the nostril. The earliest written evidence of nose piercing dates back about 4,000 years, and nose piercing appears in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, which is thought to have been composed sometime around the 5th century BCE. It's thought that nose piercing originated in the Middle East and from there spread to other places like India. Of course, there are also instances of cultures that practiced nostril piercing that had absolutely no contact with the Middle East or India or anywhere else, including Aboriginal cultures of New Zealand and Australia and pre-Columbian indigenous cultures of the Americas. It does seem like the next logical leap after piercing your ears. If you're looking for another place to hang more adornment, the nostril is a good bit of real estate. It sticks out from your face a bit, it's in the center of your face, and it's probably going to heal relatively quickly. Pre-Columbian cultures practiced both nostril and septum piercing, with different locations of piercings potentially denoting exactly where someone was from. Nostril piercings continue to be incredibly popular, if not specifically culturally important, in the Middle East and South Asia. And it's thought that nose piercing was brought to South Asia sometime between the 10th and 13th centuries. Septum piercing seem to have been nearly as widespread. In ancient Carthage, gold septum rings were worn by both men and women. There are ancient Carthaginian statues depicting the wearing of thick septum rings, which look a bit incongruous compared to the otherwise classical nature of the statue. Septum piercing was practiced by multiple indigenous Native American tribes, including the Shawnee and presumably at least a few others, but the information is scant and has very weird, noble savage undertones whenever I try to find more. In Central Australia, septum piercing was integral to several coming-of-age rituals, including one practiced by the Arunta tribe, where the septum was pierced and a bone was inserted, intended to create a flattened look in the nose. Septum piercings have been, and continue to be, popular in Bangladesh and Nepal. The most exceptional and probably most famous septum piercings are those of the many pre-Columbian cultures that engaged in the practice. Like ear ornaments, the practice of piercing the septum and wearing a large, elaborate nose ornament was practiced by the Maya, Mexica, Mixtec, Tairona, Moche, Kalima, Sinu, and so many others. The ornaments intended to be worn in the septum piercing could range from simple gold hoops, including what appear to be faux piercings, merely clips to wear for the pierced septum look, to absolutely intimidating constructions of mixed gold and silver, with realistic figures of shellfish or stylized and terrifying images of gods. I am generalizing a lot here. Of course, there's some overlap in the beliefs, artistic styles, and metalsmithing techniques of many pre-Columbian cultures, but they are not a monolith. Each culture had its distinct, unique style, and what was represented on nose ornaments varied from one culture to the next. For instance, the Moche people of Peru were especially fond of using gold and silver together, as well as depicting animals and nature. One thing that I think is particularly fascinating is that the first woman to popularize the quote-unquote modern nose piercing in Europe and in the United States opted for a fairly large septum ring in the Carthaginian style. Her name was Émilie Marie Bouchard, stage name Polaire, a French actress and singer known for her painfully corseted 16-inch wasp waist. She was also known for her daring, exotic choice of face jewelry, a nose ring. Usually shown as a septum ring, but in some photos shown as a nostril ring. I assume she must have had both pierced. She also had a pet pig named Mimi who wore a diamond collar, and all of this was taking place in the 19-teens, so people really were quite scandalized by that nose ring. All right, y'all, this is where we're going to leave it for today. Next week, we are going to cover the more titillating stuff as promised earlier in the episode, the royal genitalia and all of that. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, an exploration into how we are all continuing a tradition that's older than recorded history by punching holes into our faces and our ears. Again, they're low-stakes wounds if you're going to have to inflict one on yourself. Hence the high success rate of the practice and why we are still engaging in it today. If you liked what you heard, please leave me a rating and review wherever you're listening. If you didn't like what you heard, please go tell literally anyone else. If you would like to follow me on Patreon and have access to voting and polls, as well as a monthly bonus video, you can find that at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. If you would like to watch my videos, you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under moonhoney.jewelry. If you would like to see my goldsmithing work, as well as the jewelry that I make, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. Last but not least, the merch for this show can be found at merch.shopmoonhoney.com. Yes, you too can have your very own That Asshole Christopher Columbus tote bag. There is a handful of you carrying this tote bag and terrorizing your local library and supermarket, and nothing makes me happier. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next week when we talk about whether or not Roman soldiers pierced their nipples to hold their capes in place, Prince Albert, and of course, more ancient history jewelry stories.